The sea has always carried whispers of freedom and despair, but in February 1766, off the treacherous waters of the Cape of Good Hope, those whispers erupted into a roar of rebellion. A Dutch East India Company ship, the Mirman, sailed heavy with human cargo, enslaved Malagasy captives taken from Madagascar and destined for lives of brutal labor in the Cape Colony. Shackled, beaten, and torn from their homeland, they were meant to vanish into the machinery of empire. But the ocean offered them something the land had taken away, a chance to fight back. Below deck, the air was thick with salt, sweat, and the stifling stench of captivity. Yet, beneath the silence of fear, sparks of defiance flickered. The Malagasy men and women watched their captors carefully, noting weaknesses, moments of distraction, the weight of the sailors' weapons. They had nothing to lose. Freedom was already gone, death was a familiar shadow, but dignity could still be reclaimed. And so, a plan began to take shape: seize the ship, turn its sails toward Madagascar, and return home, even if it meant blood on the planks. When the moment came, it was swift and merciless. Enslaved hands reached for spears meant to control them, and with cries of fury, the captives turned chains into weapons. Dutch sailors, stunned by the sudden surge, found themselves outnumbered on their own deck. The Mirman, once a vessel of oppression, transformed in an instant into a battlefield adrift at sea. But rebellion at sea is never simple. Winds change, loyalties fracture, and deception becomes as deadly as cannon fire. The Malagasy, brave and desperate, steered the ship not toward freedom, but into a cruel snare of betrayal and misdirection. What began as the greatest act of defiance on the Indian Ocean would end in tragedy, but also in legend. This is the story of the Meermin Mutiny, of captives who dared to defy an empire, of sailors who fought to survive, and of a ship that carried both hope and despair in its sails. Forgotten by many, it remains one of the most haunting episodes of resistance in the history of slavery. The Dutch East India Company, known as the VOC, was one of the most powerful trading empires the world had ever seen. Its ships crisscrossed the oceans, hauling spices, silk, and porcelain, but behind its gleaming cargoes lay darker holds filled with enslaved human beings. To the VOC, people could be counted and sold just like barrels of sugar or sacks of coffee. The Cape Colony, perched on the southern tip of Africa, was a vital way station for the company's vast network. Ships traveling between Europe and Asia stopped there to rest, repair, and resupply. But a colony could not run on wind and water alone. It needed labor, endless labor, and for the Dutch, the solution was slavery. They drew captives from as far as Mozambique, Madagascar, and Indonesia, building a society where European masters stood on the backs of countless others. Madagascar was a particular target. The island, lush and sprawling, was seen by traders as a reservoir of human bodies. Raiding parties and middlemen captured villagers, marched them to ports, and sold them to Dutch factors who waited with silver and muskets. Families were torn apart in the span of an evening, and the unlucky were herded onto ships like the Mirman, bound for Cape Town. The voyage itself was a gauntlet of suffering. Men, women, and children were crammed below deck, shackled in pairs, lying in spaces barely large enough to turn. Disease spread quickly in the foul air, and punishment for resistance was brutal. But amid this cruelty, the Malagasy carried fragments of their songs, their faiths, and their languages, whispering to each other in the dark. These fragments would soon become the seeds of rebellion. The Mirman was not the largest of the VOC's fleet, but on that February voyage it carried more than cargo. It carried the volatile mixture of fear and hope, despair and rage that could turn the timbers of a ship into the stage for mutiny. The Dutch officers believed their control was absolute, enforced by whips and iron, but the ocean had its own rules. And deep within the ship, a dangerous thought was spreading. If chains could be fastened, then chains could also be broken. The days at sea stretched long, measured not by the sun's rise and fall, but by the crack of the whip and the groan of timbers under sail. For the Dutch sailors, routine was everything. Scrub the deck, trim the sails, ration the water, count the captives below. They believed discipline and distance would keep control, that the Malagasy were too broken by chains to resist. But the sailors mistook silence for surrender. In the darkness below deck, Silence carried a different weight. It was the quiet of calculation, of eyes watching each step the guards took, of ears marking when weapons were left unattended. Shackles rubbed raw against wrists and ankles, but each scrape of iron was also a reminder that iron could be turned into something else. Whispers traveled from captive to captive, weaving a secret thread of resolve that the sailors could not hear. The Malagasy knew the sea was treacherous, yet the ocean was also a path home. Some had seen the stars used to guide ships, others watched the helmsman's hand on the wheel. Freedom was not an abstract dream, it was a direction, a coast that lay somewhere beyond the endless horizon. To reach it, they would need courage, timing, and above all, surprise. The sailors grew careless. To force the captives to clean fish and work on deck, they sometimes released small groups from chains. Spears used for defense against pirates and sharks were placed in Malagasy hands under guard. It was a mistake, born of arrogance. They believed the enslaved would not dare lift such weapons against their masters, but every moment spent holding a spear was a rehearsal for the rebellion to come. The sea winds carried more than salt. They carried tension, thick as storm clouds. The Dutch laughed over their rations of rum, unaware that the same hands gutting fish with their weapons would soon be gutting the thin line that held their authority together. Above them, gulls circled in endless cries, as if mocking the fragile order of men who believed a ship could cage the human spirit. Soon, the deck of the Mirman would become a battlefield, and the ocean would decide who lived, who died, and who would see the coast of freedom again. The morning began like any other. The sun split the horizon in shards of gold, and the sailors barked their orders with weary monotony. Fish were hauled in from nets, and the Malagasy were summoned from the darkness below to clean them. Iron rattled against wood as a few captives were unchained and handed spears meant for sharks. The sailors thought nothing of it. They had done this before. But today was different. One captive lingered on the deck, his eyes locked on the weapon in his hands. The spear's wooden shaft was rough, heavy, alive with possibility. Around him, others exchanged fleeting glances, silent signals sharpened by desperation. The Dutch had grown blind to these glances, blind to the current of rage simmering beneath the still surface. When the first blow came, it was as sudden as a thunderclap. A spear swung not at fish, but at flesh, driving deep into a sailor's side. The man's cry split the air, startling gulls into flight, but before his companions could react, more spears were raised. The deck erupted in chaos, shouts in Dutch clashing with Malagasy war cries, iron striking wood, blood splattering across planks. Sailors scrambled for weapons, but panic dulled their reflexes. They were outnumbered, surrounded by men who had nothing left to lose. Shackled captives surged forward, wielding chains like whips, striking their captors with the very bonds meant to hold them down. The ship tilted under the frenzy, sails snapping as if the wind itself had joined the revolt. For a brief, burning moment, the Mirman was no longer a vessel of empire. It was an arena where centuries of oppression condensed into a single violent act of defiance. The Dutch, so confident in their dominance, now tasted the fear they had fed to others. The Malagasy, once voiceless cargo, had seized the rhythm of battle, their cries echoing across the sea. Victory, for a heartbeat, seemed possible. Blood stained the deck, and the Dutch reeled from the ferocity of their captives. The Meerman's course no longer belonged to its captain. It belonged to the desperate, the defiant, the enslaved who demanded to be free. But the ocean is a cruel ally, and victory at sea is never simple. Even as the mutineers gripped their hard-won weapons, storms of betrayal and deception already brewed on the horizon. The screams of the first clash still echoed when silence fell over the deck. Sailors lay wounded or dead, their lifeblood running in dark rivers between the planks. The Malagasy rebels stood breathless, spears in their hands, eyes blazing with something stronger than rage: hope. For the first time since their capture, the chains felt light, almost meaningless. The Dutch survivors, trembling, dropped their weapons and raised their hands. Their captain, Gerrit Muller, was bloodied but alive, glaring with a mix of fury and disbelief. To him, the unthinkable had happened. The cargo had transformed into conquerors. The ship that was once his domain now answered to voices he could not command. The Malagasy wasted no time. They swept across the deck, disarming sailors, binding them with the same ropes once used on themselves. Shackled comrades were hauled from below, blinking into the sunlight, their chains smashed with hammers until iron clattered uselessly onto the boards. Each freed prisoner added to the chorus of voices, a storm of relief and vengeance. In the chaos, a leader emerged. His name has been lost to history, but in that moment, he became the face of defiance. Standing tall, he pointed his spear at the captain and barked orders in Malagasy. The message was clear. The ship will turn east, back to Madagascar, back to home. Fear flickered in the sailors' eyes. Some nodded quickly, eager to appease, but Muller's mind raced. He knew the currents, the stars, the coastline of Africa. He also knew that without him, the Malagasy could not hope to navigate the waters of the Cape. And so even in defeat, he began to weave deception. He ordered his men to appear cooperative. They adjusted sails, shifted the wheel, and made a show of steering eastward. To the Malagasy, the bow seemed to turn toward sunrise, toward their homeland. Relief swept over the rebels. They sang low songs of return, their voices rolling like waves across the deck. But the Dutch were steering not for Madagascar. Quietly, through cunning and manipulation, they angled the Mirman back toward the Cape. The ocean, vast and indifferent, became the stage for this slow, cruel trick, a voyage of false hope. Days passed in tense balance. The Malagasy guarded the sailors closely, weapons always near. Yet each sunrise looked strangely familiar, each coastline strangely unchanged. Whispers stirred among the freed captives. Were they truly heading home or circling endlessly in betrayal? The dream of freedom glowed, but doubt gnawed at its edges. The uneasy alliance dragged on as the Meermin cut through the waters off southern Africa. By day, the Malagasy stood guard with spears in hand, their eyes never leaving the sailors at the wheel. By night, they huddled on deck, whispering of home, of mothers and children, of rice fields and rivers they might never see again. Every creak of the mast was a reminder of both possibility and peril. The Dutch crew played their part well. They bent their backs to the sails, adjusted the rigging, and pointed at the stars as if charting a course toward Madagascar. Their faces wore the masks of compliance, but in the captain's cabin, whispered counsels plotted betrayal. Garrett Muller knew the seas, and he knew the coast. If he could keep the illusion long enough, the ship could be brought back within reach of the Cape Colony's guns. Each sunrise stretched the Malagasy between hope and suspicion. The sun rose where it should, yet the wind's direction never seemed to change. The coastline, glimpsed in faint outlines, looked less like Madagascar and more like the familiar contours of Africa's southern shore. Whispers of doubt hardened into confrontation. One night, under a blood-red moon, the rebels demanded answers. They pressed the sailors, pointing spears at their throats, demanding to know if the ship was truly heading east. The Dutch, feigning innocence, gestured vaguely at the sky. Few Malagasy understood their words, but the gestures and false smiles only deepened mistrust. Arguments broke out among the freed captives themselves. Some urged immediate slaughter of the sailors and full control of the ship. Others argued that they needed the Dutch to navigate. Without them, the ocean was endless death. This division, sharp as any blade, became the crack the captain sought to exploit. Then came the first sight of land. It was not the green hills of Madagascar, but the dunes and plains of South Africa's Cape Coast. The realization struck like thunder. They had been deceived. Anger erupted, a storm of shouts and raised weapons. The Malagasy surged across the deck, dragging sailors forward, demanding truth. The Dutch admitted nothing, but the coast spoke for itself. Hope wavered. The dream of returning home was slipping. Some cried out in despair, others in rage. The captives had seized the ship, but control of the ocean was slipping through their fingers. The battle for the Meermin was no longer one of chains versus freedom. It was now a duel of will and cunning, a struggle between desperate rebels and seasoned deceivers, with the vast ocean as both witness and judge. The coastline loomed larger with each passing tide. Rolling dunes, scrub-covered plains, and jagged rocks marked the land that was supposed to be salvation. For the Malagasy rebels, hearts surged with desperate hope. If they could reach the shore, perhaps they could find a way back to their homeland. But the Dutch crew knew this was not Madagascar. It was the Cape Colony, where muskets, cannons, and colonial militias waited. The Dutch played their final card with calculated precision. They told the rebels that small boats would carry them to the shore, where they could gather supplies before continuing eastward. To the weary captives, this sounded like mercy, a step closer to home. The rebels, clinging to hope, agreed. Hope. As the longboats were lowered, the first groups of Malagasy climbed in, weapons clutched tightly, eyes fixed on the shore. The sailors rowed steadily, guiding them through the waves. But on the beach, Dutch settlers and soldiers were already waiting. Muskets glinted in the sun, barrels leveled. The trap was sprung. Gunfire tore the air, cutting down rebels before their feet touched the sand. Cries of defiance turned to screams of pain. Some leapt into the surf, trying to swim away, only to be struck down in the waves. Others, still aboard the Mirman, watched in horror as their comrades fell. Panic erupted. On deck, the remaining Malagasy realized too late that they had been betrayed from the start. Some raised their weapons, charging the sailors in a final act of fury, while others collapsed in despair, beaten not by chains but by deceit. The Dutch crew, seizing the chaos, turned on the exhausted rebels with knives, muskets, and sheer desperation. By dusk, the deck was slick with blood. The last cries faded into silence, broken only by the groan of the ship's timbers. The mutiny, so bold and daring, ended not with triumph but with betrayal and slaughter. Survivors were dragged in chains back to Cape Farms, their dreams of return extinguished. The Mirman, once a vessel of commerce, became a coffin of broken hopes. The ocean carried no whispers of victory, only the memory of a people who had come within sight of freedom, only to be undone by treachery. And yet, the story of the Mirman endured. It was passed down not as defeat alone, but as testimony to courage. For a brief blazing moment, captives became captains and chains became spears. Their struggle was not erased. It became legend. In the aftermath, the Mirman lay anchored off the cape, its decks eerily quiet. The ship that had carried defiance across the waves was now scarred by blood and silence. Dutch officials swarmed aboard, taking notes, counting survivors, recording losses in the cold language of colonial bureaucracy. To them, this was not a tragedy. It was an incident, something to be filed away, a cautionary tale for future voyages. The Malagasy who survived the massacre were dragged ashore in chains, marched into the interior under armed guard. Some were sold into bondage on Cape Farms, their names erased and replaced with the branding of new masters. Others vanished into records marked only as rebels, destined to disappear in the fields of Stellenbosch or the kitchens of colonial estates. Their dream of returning home was extinguished, their voices swallowed by the machinery of empire. Yet the memory lingered in fragments. Dutch officers wrote reports of cargo uprising, describing with fear how enslaved men and women had seized a ship and nearly wrested control of it entirely. Settlers whispered of the day Africans almost turned the ocean into a path of return rather than captivity. For the Malagasy themselves, the story survived in silence, in the hearts of families who never saw their kin again. The Meermin Mutiny was buried under layers of colonial denial. For centuries, it remained little more than a footnote, overshadowed by larger tales of empire and conquest. But when historians uncovered the records in later centuries, the truth resurfaced. In 1766, enslaved Africans had seized their own fate, even if only for a fleeting moment. The mutiny fits into a long, unbroken chain of resistance. From the holds of the Amistad to the burning wreck of the Clotilda, from plantations in Jamaica to the forests of Madagascar, enslaved people never accepted their fate quietly. The Mirman rebels stood in that lineage, proof that resistance was not rare but constant, woven into every chapter of slavery's history. Though they never reached Madagascar, their story returned home in another way, as legend. Today, the Meermin Mutiny is remembered not just in dusty archives, but in the spirit of resilience that refuses to let such acts vanish. Their defiance at sea speaks across centuries, reminding us that even in chains, human beings dreamed of freedom and dared to fight for it. Centuries later, the ocean still carried the ghost of the Mirman. In the archives of the Dutch East India Company, buried between ledgers of trade and cargo lists, the mutiny survived in brittle ink. But paper could not capture the fire that had burned in the hearts of the Malagasy rebels. It took modern eyes to pull the story back into the light. In the 20th and 21st centuries, historians began piecing together the fragments. Dutch reports, colonial diaries, and official testimonies revealed not just a ship seized, but a people who dared to claim the impossible. Museums in South Africa took interest, reconstructing the tale of the Meermin for new generations. Exhibits displayed models of the ship, accounts of the mutiny, and the haunting truth of its ending. For Madagascar, the story resonated like a distant echo. The names of those who boarded the Mirman in 1766 may never be known, but their defiance became part of a wider heritage of resistance. In the villages of Madagascar, oral traditions remembered countless raids and kidnappings, the terror of slave ships stealing loved ones away. The Mirman was one vessel among many, but its mutiny embodied the spirit that no chain could silence. Divers and archaeologists searched the Cape's coastal waters, hoping to find the remains of the Mirman. Some wrecks were studied, some mysteries solved, but the exact fate of the ship itself remains uncertain. Was it scrapped, sunk, or simply renamed and erased? The sea keeps its secrets, but the legend endures. Today, the Meermin Mutiny stands as a reminder that resistance was not rare, it was universal. It was the natural response to enslavement, repeated again and again across oceans and centuries. From Haiti's mountains to Jamaica's cane fields, from the swamps of Louisiana to the Cape Seas, enslaved people fought back with fire, with words, with songs, with steel. In South Africa, the story is now told in classrooms, museums, and memorials. It challenges the silence once imposed by colonial narratives. It asks, who were the Malagasy rebels whose names we do not know? What did they dream of as they steered east, believing they might see home again? And what does it mean for us today to remember them? The Mirman never reached Madagascar, but its mutiny crossed time. It stands beside the Amistad, the Clotilda, and every act of defiance that slavery tried to bury. It is not just a story of betrayal and loss, it is a story of courage, of people who seized a ship in the vast ocean and declared, if only for a moment, we are free.